Hi guys, Honor Robert here, and welcome back to the 17 spooky stories for this October. And last time we read The Silver Eyes, the graphic novel variant by from the Five Nights at Freddy's book series, the original four, not the Fazbear Frights books, which I do appreciate, I do like. I've actually listened to most of them, I want to say, on audiobook. I think I stopped at Fetch. I think I still need to listen to Fetch on audiobook. But anyway, I really enjoyed doing a dramatic reading of that. And hopefully you guys enjoyed listening to it. I'm probably going to mark that one when I upload it as not for kids because of certain language that is used in it, and I don't want to get, my video to get flagged for language because I said it was for kids. So I'm going to try to remember to mark that as for not for kids. Strictly because of language that is in that particular book. Just being cautious. I know the books technically were originally intended to be for kids, but I don't want YouTube to be mad at me, so I'm gonna mark it as not for kids. So yeah. But enough about that. Today we are reading something a little more lighter, but it still goes into the psychological area a little bit. We are reading Young Wit, The Shroud of Secrecy by Dave Arnold and Phil Lawler. So a little bit of background about this. Growing up, Adventures in Odyssey was always a big part of my life, and it still is to this day. It was like the go-to thing to listen to for my family when we were on long car rides, to and from church, what else? Every night at dinner. Adventures in Odyssey was like the go-to thing to listen to for me and my family. So this is a book that is supposed to be like a prequel to the majority of the Adventures in Odyssey episodes, but the main thing is they set it up, or at least they set up these first three books like it takes place in an alternate universe than the actual audio drama series, because they change a few things that if you're a longtime listener, you will know right away, oh, they rewrote that scene. So just pointing that out, this book is supposed to be like an alternate universe. It's not supposed to be canon to the Adventures in Odyssey radio audio drama series. So, just getting that out of the way, let's get into it. For Steve. Chapter 1. John Avery Whitaker stood. There we go. John Avery was getting off to a great start. John Avery Whitaker stood perched on the rooftop of the oversized shed in his backyard. His breath held in a mixture of fear and eager anticipation. From where he stood, the distance to the ground must have been at least 20 feet. Surely that will be enough to achieve lift, he thought. His arms wagged up and down, but the drag from the wings he had fashioned out of a mixture of cloth, leaves, and feathers did little to elevate him. Instead, it made his arms feel heavy and tired. Not a good sign. His prior attempt with papier-mâché wings had failed before it ever began. His stepmother Fiona made him abort his flight out of a fair concern that he would break his neck in the attempt. He realized she was right. Those wings were far too heavy, almost as heavy as his arms felt at this very moment. But these wings, which had been patterned roughly after Leonardo da Vinci's ornithopter flying machine had enough resistance to displace a good chunk of air, surely enough to levitate a lean 10-year-old boy, and they seem light enough to somewhat oppose the laws of gravity. At the least. He should land softly enough to avoid a trip to the hospital. That was the hope. Anyway. Johnny stood on the roof's edge, wondering whether it was how young Arcus felt. Johnny had read the Greek myth that detailed Daedalus and his son Icarus' attempt to escape imprisonment by Cretan king Minos, using wings fashioned of feathers held together by wax. Johnny's smile disappeared when he recalled that their attempt failed. When Icarus flew too close to the sun, the wax melted. His wings fell apart, and Icarus fell into the sea and drowned. Undeterred, Johnny gritted his courage, flapping his arms fervently and setting fear aside. In a leap of faith, encouraged by the science of the ornithology, jumped mightily into the air. As his body thrust inches above the rooftop, he imagined himself besting the glorious flight of Orville and Wilbur Wright, the pioneers of aviation. When he finally awoke from his concussive state to see his father hovering over him, he realized that the Wright brothers' record had surely survived, just as he somehow had done. "John, if you live to be 15, it'll be a miracle," his father said. As Johnny saw his father loom over him, he realized two very important things. The first was that he wanted every kid to have the opportunity to feel the way he felt when he jumped off that ledge. The thrill of that moment. When he experienced the effortless exploits of the simplest baby birds born every day was unimaginable. The second was that he wanted every kid to have that experience without jumping. As thrilling as the jump had been, it could never surpass the pain of the crash landing. But as Johnny lay there, gasping for breath, he already knew that both joy and pain would most likely be his constant companion through life. There has to be a way to cheat pain, he thought. If only we could have the same thrill inside our imagination. Chapter 2. Roads are remarkable things. Each curve and turn may present a new view, an unexpected adventure, or an unforeseen challenge. So when Johnny Ray Whitaker walked down the country road of Newberry County, North Carolina, just outside his hometown of Providence, he wondered what the next bend would hold. The last few weeks had certainly shaken Johnny's world. He and his friend Emmy Capello had solved a 70-year-old mystery involving his great-grand uncle and the great-grandfather of his nemesis, Wilson Knox, the grandfather of the school janitor, Benjamin Huck. A mysterious boy met Johnny. A mysterious boy Johnny still hadn't met, and a treasure of Confederate gold. Solving the mystery had made Johnny and Emmy famous around Providence, and pretty well known throughout the country and state too. It seemed they couldn't go anywhere in town without someone pointing at them, slapping them on the back, or shaking their hand. And Johnny and his family had only been living in town for more than 2 months. A little more than 2 months. The excitement seemed to be wearing down finally, and Johnny was grateful for that. He had lots of other more important things on his mind. He trekked along the dusty tree-lined lane with his dog, Macduff, a Carnan Terrier with a penchant for not listening. Since the day they met, when Johnny accidentally stabbed him with a sword, the dog had decided to give the boy little mischief of his own. The sun alternately peeked through and hid behind clouds that skidded across the October sky. Shafts of light warmed for a moment, but the cool fall air reminded him that summer was a thing of the past and the future. Macduff sniffed every interesting log, bush, and plant, seemingly gathering some vital piece of information from each. Atop the dog's head sat a makeshift deer stalker cap, like the one Sherlock Holmes wore. Johnny tore through mystery novels, and Holmes was his favorite detective of the bunch. He figured that since Macduff always sniffed about for clues, he should be garbed like a detective. But Macduff hated having the cap on his head. The first time Johnny got it on him, the dog twisted and turned every way he could to get it off, like a wild horse bucking its rider. But eventually he succumbed to the wishes of his master. At least he didn't have to tote the calabash pipe that Holmes smoked. Johnny gave up on that when the ornery dog chewed it in half. Johnny was on his own investigation. He'd been mulling over what to make of the conversation he'd overheard between his father, Harold, a professor at Duke University, and Harold's colleague, Professor Carl Mangel. A few days prior, Mangel had mentioned what surely was the ancient journal Johnny had found in the old wooden trunk he'd inherited from his grandfather, Jackson McClintock. Mangel said he'd been searching for the journal and that it contained information about a special cloth that had power to heal and give long life. Johnny had a strong feeling that Mangel was after the cloth Johnny had wrapped around Macduff after he'd unintentionally stabbed him in the forest while practicing to be one of the 3 musketeers. After all, the pup had seemed to be dying, but when Johnny had returned from getting medical supplies, he'd found the dog hadn't died. He'd been completely healed. The cloth neatly folded on the ground beside the pup, hadn't had a spot on it, and that cloth had come from the same place as the journal, the trunk. Johnny had taken Macduff home and asked for permission to keep him for Johnny's stepsister, Charlie. Their nickname for her, Charlotte. It was love at first sight. They ran and jumped and tumbled and wrestled. Macduff smothered the girl with slobbery kisses, and Charlie nuzzled into the scruff of the pup's neck and hugged him so tightly his eyes bulged. Fiona also took to the pup. "It'll be good to have a guard dog about the place," she said. "I don't know about that," Johnny replied. "From what I can tell, he's too much of a coward. It's more likely we'd be protecting him instead." Johnny turned to his father. Here was where the whole thing would likely hit a wall. His father never cared much for dogs. What kind of person doesn't like a dog? Johnny thought. He chalked it up to a character deficiency. There we go. Harold said nothing at first, but between Fiona cocking her head and smiling coyly at him, and Charlie's non-stop stream of begging and pleading, "Please, Daddy, he's so cute. We need him. He needs us. Please, 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 please." Harold's resolve melted. He sighed deeply with a faint smile at the corners of his mouth. "Fine," he said. Johnny's father had no difficulty saying no to anyone, except Fiona or Charlotte. They seemed to know how to get him to agree to anything. He turned to Johnny. "But he's your responsibility, young man. Not mine, not your mother's, not your sister's. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." He understood completely. One wrong move and the dog would be gone. Normally, Johnny might have balked at such a constraint. After all, Charlie clearly loved Macduff too, so it would only be fair for her to share some of the responsibility of caring for him. But aside from keeping Macduff, Johnny had an ulterior motive for not pushing back on his father's edict. A motive that also had to do with the journal. At dinner 2 nights before, Johnny had felt his father staring at him so intently that he wondered whether Harold had burrowed into his mind and was reading his every thought. As they finished dessert and Fiona took Charlie upstairs to get ready for bed, Harold had said as casually as he could, "I've discovered the meaning of those foreign words your friend Emmy recently asked you about. Would you like me to tell her, or would you like to deliver the message to her yourself?" Johnny's heart had done a flip, but he had remained as casual as he could. "Oh, yeah, I forgot about that," he said. "I can do it, if you want." Harold's face had remained impassive, but his eyes had bored into Johnny's. He then reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded slip of paper, slid it across the table. Johnny picked it up and put it in his pocket. "I'll give it to her on the way to school tomorrow." "Don't you want to know what it says?" Johnny shrugged. Emmy will tell me if she wants me to know. Wasn't exactly a lie, since he had given the words to Emmy in the first place. She would definitely want him to know. Still, felt bad about skirting the issue like this. But then he recalled that his father had also lied to Mangle about where the words came from. On the way to school the next morning, Johnny gave Emmy the paper with the transcription. So this one, he said, pointing to, prepare to have whatever language this is butchered. You have been warned. Nemhened Flor Pris means pearl of great price. And this one, he pointed to Betha Vahada, means long life. Emmy gave him a sideways glance. I can read, you know. Old Scots Gaelic? Thank you. Okay, so it's... that's probably... Okay, so it's like dialect. Okay. I probably could... Oh well. Johnny smirked. That's what that is? She shrugged, refolding the paper and put it in her pocket. Okay, good to know. In case I ever go to Scotland. It's important to know right here in Providence, Johnny corrected. Why? Because my father might ask you about them. She stopped, concerned. You think he will? I wouldn't be surprised. I also wouldn't be surprised if he asked you whether I put you up to giving them to him in the first place. Which you did. Right, but he doesn't know that. Johnny started walking again, and Emmy followed. Sounds like you think he does. He shrugged. Maybe it's wishful thinking. I'd prefer to be able to talk to my dad without hiding stuff. But you've seen how we are. We just don't get along that well. Not since my mother died. Emmy stopped again. Wait. Fiona's not your mom? Johnny shook his head. Stepmom. My birth mom died a few years ago. Empathy emanated from Emmy's face. I'm so sorry. That must have been really hard. We're in a Great Depression. Everything's hard. They trudged the rest of the way to school in silence. Life had certainly been a mix of challenges and ambiguity, Johnny thought. So many things had gone upside down for his young life. First his mother died, and soon after his grandpa Jackson. After that, his father remarried, and they all moved, and everything he loved was gone or being replaced. The most curious thing of all, the mystery that kept running through Johnny's brain these last few days, was that Grandpa Jackson wrote Johnny's name as the final entry in the journal. Why? What reason could there be to write his name there? Was it just to designate who was to receive the journal next? Or was it something more? And since the journal had been given to him, what was he supposed to do with it? Especially since he only knew a smattering of Latin and couldn't read Old Scots Gaelic either, or any of the other languages in the journal, for that matter. Johnny found the best way to work through one problem was to mull over it while you worked on another. Either his brain enjoyed the extra activity, or solutions simply came easier when he wasn't overthinking the issue. Either way, he usually seemed to find the solution better if he let it stew in the sauce of activity. So the next day, which was Saturday, he happily rounded up all the items he needed to create his All Hallows Eve costume. His parents didn't allow the celebration of Halloween. They said the holiday glamorized evil spirits and witches. But his father did allow them to celebrate All Hallows Eve, the night before All Saints' Day. At first, Johnny intended to dress up as D'Artagnan from the Three Musketeers. But since that's how Macduff got stabbed, he quickly went off the idea. And since All Saints' Day commemorates the saints and martyrs of the church, he thought his stepmother would be pleased if he chose to dress up as a biblical figure. He knew the most about Moses. And now, as he walked down the road on a glorious fall Saturday with Macduff scampering about, Johnny was about to create his costume. He was half a mile outside of town carrying the supplies he believed would work to create a paste that, when combined, would make him glow like Moses when he descended from Mount Sinai after receiving the Ten Commandments. In addition to a few items he found in the forest, like some mushrooms and fungi he had observed glowing in the dark, the clerk at the town drugstore gate had given him supervised access to anything deemed safe that he needed from his lab supplies. One of the perks of his newfound celebrity status. Johnny came to the end of the road, then took the short trail leading to what had recently become his favorite spot, a small clearing beside the Enoch River. It rustled up to the rocky mound where a sort of grotto provided a perfect campfire enclosure and a great place to think and work. When he had arrived, he saw a few empty bean and soup cans littering the ground. Within the trees, about 10 yards off, he noticed that several things had changed. Rocks were piled in a heap. A tree that had fallen was removed from where it had lain, and was now propped over a hole. It appeared as if someone had been digging. Carved into a side of the tree facing the path were symbols, one that looked like 2 diamonds and another that looked like the number 8 divided in half. Johnny wondered what the symbols meant. He hadn't seen them the last time he came. He frowned, disappointed that someone else had found his spot. Whoever it was must have camped there. He quickly built a small fire and began to prepare his glow concoction in a cast iron pot he had smuggled from the house. He had decided it would be much better to cook the experiment outside. Fiona didn't appreciate it when he created a mess in her kitchen. Fair enough. Especially when the mess was accompanied by odors his experiments usually brought with them. Besides, she always thought his concoctions would blow up. It had only happened that one time, and that was last year, back in their house in Charlotte. And how could he have known that ethylene glycol had a flash point of 111 C? He ground up the various components. You can speak, Honor, come on. Adding them one by one into the pot. The concoction soon became a soupy mix, and a greenish tint emerged, which brought a smile and a hint of a radiant glow to Johnny's face. Both vanished, however, when Macduff bolted after a squirrel scoring nearby for food. The dog's barks came in rapid succession, 20 or more in 5 seconds. He sped along, nipping at the squirrel's flailing bushy tail, jumping over logs, through dead branches and around moss-covered boulders in hot pursuit. "Macduff, get back here!" Johnny commanded, but Macduff either couldn't hear him or chose not to. Johnny took off after the dog, irritated by his mutinous behavior. Within seconds, Johnny found himself near the river's edge, where he slipped on a loose rock and went down hard. He only fell into a few inches of water, but the splash was enough to fairly drench his clothes. He jumped up and renewed his chase, though with a bit more care for where he stepped. When he emerged at the top of the embankment, he called out, "Macduff, don't bother coming home! You worthless mutt!" A voice startled him. "Can I have him then?" Johnny whipped around to see 2 boys, one hunched over Macduff, petting his back, and the other in a rickety old wheelchair. The latter offered a smile. "I wouldn't mind so much," Johnny answered, "but my sister would have a fit." The boy in the chair nodded. "Let me guess. Since your dog is dressed like Sherlock, you must be Watson." "No. But like Watson, my first name is John." He stuck out his hand. "John Whittaker." "I'm Steve." He slowly opened his hand, and Johnny noticed the weakness in Steve's grip. There we go. As the boy shook, his arms were very... He slowly opened his hand, and Johnny noticed the weakness in Steve's grip as the boy shook. His arms were very thin, as was the rest of his body. This goof petting the dog is my kid brother, Paul. Paul clarified. I'm only you tears younger." You tears? You tears? Johnny asked, confused. 2 years, Steve corrected. He gets his words mixed up sometimes. He studied Johnny carefully. Hey, aren't you that guy who solved the Confederate gold mystery? Paul piped up.
Yeah, I thought I recognized you. You must be real smart.
Johnny reddened. Oh, I had lots of help. Maybe we can solve a mystery together. You working on anything right now? Maybe we can solve a mystery together. You working on anything right now? Johnny shook his head. No. No mysteries. Which isn't entirely true, Johnny thought. But they don't need to know that. Steve sniffed as if he were Macduff searching for squirrels. Do you smell something burning? My experiment! Johnny ran back to the fire. Paul pushed Stevie's wheelchair in pursuit, trundling behind Johnny on the worn but uneven path, the bumps jostling Steve around like a rag doll. What are you cooking? Steve asked when they arrived. Some stuff I need to make me glow in the dark. I'm making my costume for All Hallows Eve. You mean Halloween?
You mean Halloween,
Paul corrected, raising his head from Macduff, who was happily licking his face. Traitor, Johnny thought. No, my family doesn't celebrate that.
Boo-tad,
Paul said, again twisting his words around.
I get a pillowcase full of candy every year. It lasts for days.
I don't mind. I don't care much for candy, Johnny said. Steve gaped at him. Seriously? What kind of kid doesn't like candy? It's an American institution, like baseball, hot dogs, and apple pie. Johnny shrugged. I like ice cream sodas. Well, that's something, I guess, Steve said with a grin. Johnny stirred the experimental potion. Paul walked up beside him and gazed into the steamy pot. That looks about as good as the food my Aunt Patty cooks. Which is pretty bad. It's not for eating, Johnny said. After it cools down, I'll lather it on my skin, and I'll stand outside in the sun. Once it gets dark, I'll glow for hours. Just a few more ingredients, then it should be done. Whatever floats your boat, Steve replied. Then pointing to Paul, he added, Hey, you don't have any potions that'll make him better looking, do you? Sorry. Paul rose up nobly.
How could you improve these ragged, rude looks?
He giggled. Then, cocking his head, he clarified.
I mean, rugged good looks.
Johnny looked more closely at Paul. Truth be told, you're resembled a drawing of Humpty Dumpty in Charlie's Mother Goose nursery rhyme book. Nice, but definitely not handsome. Johnny picked up his backpack, pulled out a couple of paper bags, and offered them to Paul. You want to add the last few ingredients? Sure, what are they? Sulfur and potassium nitrate. They help light stuff up, at least according to the book I read.
Nifty!
Paul said. Johnny handed him the bags. Don't put in too much. Just a little bit of each should. But Paul had grabbed as much as each hand would allow and tossed it all into the pot. There was a loud and blinding flash that seemed to completely engulf Paul's head. A cloud of fumes hung over him, hiding him from sight. Both he and Johnny coughed and spat with their ears ringing. Johnny called out, "Are you all right?"
I think so,
Paul said, sounding dazed. He cleared his throat, and after a few seconds the cloud dissipated. Johnny covered his mouth, while Steve laughed uproariously.
What?
Asked Paul. You don't have eyebrows and eyelashes. You didn't have eyebrows and eyelashes before, did you? Johnny asked, thinking that if Paul didn't look like Humpty Dumpty before, he sure did now. Suddenly, Steve's laughter stopped. Paul, your hair's on fire!
Ah!
Paul panicked, running around in circles, batting his head as if he were swatting a swarm of bees. But the effort did more to fan the flame than extinguish it. River! The river! Johnny yelled. Douse your head in the river! Before you could say Jack Robinson, Paul ran into the riverbank and jumped in, dunking his head beneath the water. Unfortunately, the damage was already done. When Paul emerged, Johnny and Steve saw half his hair had been singed off. All that remained were tiny curls shriveled up and at the tips that broke off when Paul touched them. I'm so sorry, Johnny said. A goofy look spread across Paul's face, and he said, It's not your fault. Besides,
It's not your fault. Besides, I've been needing a haircut.
Well, I'd say your experiment is a success, Steve said, laughing. Paul's proof that your concoction does make people glow. At that, all the boys laughed. You kind of look like Curly from the Three Stooges.
Nifty! He's my favorite food. Milk! Milk!
Paul said. Johnny doused the campfire and poured his elixir into a bottle. Then the boys made their way home, laughing and chatting as if they'd been friends their whole lives. Once they were out of sight, an older, disheveled black man with a round nose and a worn overcoat and a tan hat covered tufts of his frizzy gray hair emerged from behind a large white oak tree. He walked up to the fire pit and spat at the embers. He looked over the mound.
It's a good thing they didn't find you, Rakaya, he said aloud to the mound. If they had, I'd have to take care of them.
He sat, removed his hat, and scratched his gray head with a dirty hand. I just got to bury you, girl. I suppose I'd best move you somewheres else, though. But where? He climbed onto the rock mound and looked around. Though the tree line, through the tree line, something caught his eye. The top of the Providence Town Hall clock tower. He shook his head. No, not there. He thought for a long moment, and then muttered, but maybe. Yup, that's the place. I'll dig you up and bury you there instead. No one'll find you there. He grinned, exposing his teeth. I'll do it tonight. There's no moon tonight. He spat again. A fella can never be too careful. Chapter 3. It was early afternoon the following Monday, and Johnny's last class had just ended. As he did most days after school, he wandered down to the basement where Ben Huck, the school janitor and handyman, worked. Johnny was pleased and relieved that Ben had gotten his job back after he had been arrested. While helping Johnny with the Confederate gold adventure, they had become fast friends. Ben sat at his workbench, staring at a piece of machinery. Johnny crept up beside him and said, "Trying to control it with your mind?" Ben started, put a hand to his chest, and said, Boy, you trying to get this piece of machinery wrapped up inside your head? Don't scare me like that." Johnny laughed and held up his hands. "Sorry." Ben chuckled along with him. "School's out already? Huh. Seems like you sixth graders ought to have a longer day. You got lots to learn." You can't learn it all in a classroom," Johnny countered. So what are you working on?" "Not working yet, just pondering." Ben held up the mechanism. "These are the internal mechanics of an electrical school bell. I love the simplicity of this machine and the innovation that created it. I was wondering whether I might be able to utilize the technology in other ways." "Like what?" "I ain't sure yet, but it'll come eventually." Ben's powerful, scarred hands manufactured the manufactured his screwdriver. Maneuvered his screwdriver between the striker and the contact. So simple, but so ingenious. Sort of like me. Ben peered over his spectacles. "Yeah, only humble." They chuckled. After a moment of silence, as Ben continued to tinker, Johnny asked, "Ben, do you think it's possible to invent things that can make you live longer?" Ben lowered his screwdriver and peered over his spectacles at Johnny again.
Now why you worried about stuff like that? You're just a sprout.
I'm not exactly worried. Just wondering.
Well, I think people have been inventing things that do that for a long time. Actually, new medicines keep folks alive longer, and doctors learn things all the time that help them treat patients better.
But I mean inventing something that can just give you long life.
Ben smiled and went back to tinkering. Boy, if you're looking for the fountain of youth or science fiction nonsense, you got a long look coming. The good Lord's the only one to decide that.
I suppose.
You suppose? You ought to know.
To be honest, I don't really buy into that God stuff much.
Ben twisted his screwdriver, loosening a bit of the mechanism. Oh? And why's that?
My mom died when I was little. I figured if there really is a God, he wouldn't have taken her from me. I needed her.
Ben stopped and scratched his whiskered face with the tip of the screwdriver. So you're saying you know better than God? How do you know what you need, boy? I'm a grown-up man, nigh on to 40 years old, and I still got no idea what all I need.
Every boy needs his mother, especially when he's a kid,
Johnny replied. True enough. Ben went back to the device. You do. But we need the good Lord more. I expect your mama would tell you the same thing. Don't shove the Lord aside. He's the only one who can make sense of it all. Johnny said nothing in reply, instead turning his attention to the metal device on the floor beside the workbench. What's this for? He asked, pointing. Working on an idea to automatically feed the coal into the furnace. It's a mighty chore shoveling coal. Johnny carefully looked Ben over. Did your dad teach you how to do this stuff? Nah, mostly picked it up myself. My brain don't rest much. I got lots of ideas that need figuring out. Your daddy help you? Johnny shook his head.
He's too busy. And he doesn't really like to work with his hands. He'd rather read books.
Don't you enjoy reading? Ben asked, still tinkering.
Sure, but I suppose I'd rather be doing something.
Ben shrugged. I find that doing gets a whole lot more productive when it comes after reading. I wish I'd read my granddaddy's writing more when I was younger, as you know. Learning from them that came before us means we can build off of the things we discover. That way, we can start from where they left off. No sense reinventing the wheel, boy. Johnny nodded thoughtfully as he watched Ben work.
I wish I could invent something really important. Something that would make a difference.
Ben peered over his glasses. Now you know. You already made a big difference to lots of folks in this town. Johnny nodded reservedly.
Yeah, that's not what I mean. I mean something amazing and incredible and amazingly incredible. Like inventing a machine that, I don't know, does something amazing.
Ben chuckled. Look, boy,
There's lots of ways to make a difference. Some are, he mimicked. Johnny, amazing, but inventing an incredible machine. Johnny laughed. Ben went on. And some are practical, like building a car or something that helps folks physically. And some are ways of just helping folks cope with what's going on in their lives, like you did. But all of them take understanding. Maybe it's possible to do all of them at the same time. Johnny thought aloud. Ben's eyebrows rose. Maybe you can? What about that experiment of yours? Which one? You got more than one going on? I only heard about that glow formula thing for your costume. Oh. Yeah. I finished it down by the river. That's where I met Steve and Paul. Who and who? Johnny slapped his forehead gently. That's what I came down here for. Do you know Steve and Paul? Steve's in a wheelchair. Ben laid the bell on his work pants. Oh yeah, of course I know. In a town this small, everybody knows everybody. They seem nice. They're two peas in a pod. Seems like if one of them gets an itch, the other one starts scratching. They must not go to school here. I hadn't seen them before. Ben shook his head. They don't. I'm not sure where Paul's schooling, but there's a place in Durham that takes on kids with physical ills. That's where Steve goes. And make no mistake, that boy's bright and talented. He can draw like nobody's business. You say you met him? You say you met him down by the river? Yeah, Paul sort of helped me with my glowing formula experiment. What do you mean, sorta? A sheepish look crossed Johnny's face. Well, let's just say I know now to never let another kid add ingredients to my experiment for me. I mean, I thought everyone knew to be careful when combining combustible elements. Uh-oh, what happened? People look really different without eyebrows and eyelashes. Ben snorted, stifling a chuckle. Paul won't need a haircut for a while either. Ben threw back his head and busted out in a deep-throated laugh. Johnny joined him. Then Ben stopped, suddenly serious. You know, you probably shouldn't hang out down by the river by yourself. Drifters stay there. Ain't safe for kids. Johnny's smile faded. I've never seen any thereabouts, though I did see some empty cans littering by my favorite spot. Well, like I say, you best not go by yourself, you hear? Yes, sir. Johnny nodded. Yes, sir. Ben's smile returned. Good. Now, you should get on home. Your folks will be wondering about you.
He turned back to the mechanism. Johnny stood up and walked to the door. When he got there, he stopped and looked back at his friend. There was one thing Johnny had realized since he'd moved to Providence. It was that he could trust two people, Emmy and the man in front of him, puttering on the school bell. Ben had helped him, encouraged him, advised him, and even gone to jail for him. He should be able to tell Ben about his latest mystery with the journal and the cloth, right? Ben? Ben turned and peered at him over his spectacles. Again. Something else, boy? Johnny opened his mouth and then closed it inside. No, nothing. Thanks for the talk. See you later. Ben smiled. Bye now. He turned back to the workbench. Johnny opened the door, stepped out of the room, and closed the door softly behind him. He had never felt more alone in his life. He desperately wanted to trust somebody with his news of the cloth, someone who could help him make sense of it. But who? Chapter 4. The sun had just set as Professor Carl Mangle pulled into the garage behind his house at 236 Cluster Avenue. His mind was still spinning over his discovery that the phrases Harold Whitaker had asked him to translate several days ago were actually from an ancient journal describing the cloth that held incredible power. Mangle's belief that the cloth existed had been validated, and that now that knowledge consumed him. He had given up hope years ago, but perhaps Whitaker had said that the paper with the phrases on it came from an old book he'd bought about the history of Scotland. But Carl knew that wasn't true. First, Harold claimed he couldn't find the book when he went to look for it, but Whitaker was the most organized person he'd ever met. He knew he never misplaced anything. Second, Harold was a bad liar. He obviously had little practice in the art of deception, which Carl supposed made sense for a professor of theology. Whitaker exhibited all the tall tale signs, looking away, crossing his arms, and leaving the room. And then, when he returned, that fake expression of surprise and frustration that he couldn't find the book was enough to nearly make Mangle Irkbachton, or vomit. No, either Whitaker had possession of the journal, or he knew the person who did. Mangle exited his car, grabbing his briefcase from the back seat, and made his way through the gathering darkness toward the house. The chill of winter spiked the air as he slogged through the fallen leaves on the driveway. Every autumn he wished that he didn't have such massive trees in his yard. Trees, like dogs, shed too much. He would have to spend all day raking up and bagging all the leaves littering his property. He pondered chopping down the oaks and replacing them with something from the pine family. Yes, they shed needles, but unlike dogs, they didn't shed too much. He entered through the back door to find his wife, Freda, pulling a tray from the oven. "Kept your dinner warm?" she said with a glaze of ice in her tone. "You didn't say you'd be late."
Carl set his briefcase and keys on the counter. Papers to grade, he said was his sole apology. He had grown distant from Frida over the past few years, partly because of the pressure of his work schedule, but mostly because both felt a good deal of anxiety over their family situation. They didn't talk about it anymore, preferring to ignore it in hopes that things would resolve themselves one way or the other. Saying nothing was easier than picking the scab off the wound repeatedly. Carl sat at the table as Frida placed a plate of liver and onions in front of him.
Act! Knagged es nicht Globlin. She knows I hate liver and onions. He thought, probably why she made it.
He considered telling her the news about the journal. He thought he had a lead on its whereabouts 7 years ago, but it came to nothing. They had both pinned their final hopes on it, only to have them dashed when his search came to a dead end. 9. Better to say nothing to her until he could find out more. Harold would not readily give the information about the journal's whereabouts. He'd have to come up with some other way. Perhaps Harold's wife, Fiona, or one of his children. The phrases on the paper kept repeating in his mind.
Nahabed Forest Pritz, pearl of a great price. And Bretha Flabd, long life. He had to find that journal. It was the only way to locate the cloth. Carl ate a few bites of the liver and pushed the plate away. Some things were never meant to be eaten, he thought. Frida picked up the plate and deposited it in the sink. I'm going to bed, she said, then crossed the room and walked up the stairs. When she left, he didn't give her another thought. His mind instead returned to his time in the Holy Land. He had been researching artifacts in Jerusalem and the surrounding area when he met a man in the field who was full of energy and enthusiasm and the passion that comes from new adventures. America? The man had asked. Yes, by way of Germany. I'm a professor of religious languages at the University of North Carolina. Carl Mangel. He had offered his hand. Harold Whittaker. I'm an American as well, though I live in Scotland presently. Well, it's got to meet someone who speaks the same language. Talking in Hebrew is an exhausting exercise. You have to think before saying each word. He had grinned. That's probably a good idea in any language. The two men hit it off instantly. The following weeks were spent mostly together, moving from site to site, sharing dreams and ambitions. After they parted, they kept in contact through the years. Carl told Harold about openings at North Carolina and later at Duke University and gave him a glowing reference. He was pleased when Harold accepted each position. Excuse me.
After Mangle felt he could fully trust Harold, he told him about the discovery he had been privy to, a cloth that supposedly had the power to heal. Harold was enthralled at the information, though it was likely, he said, nothing more than a myth, legends. He deduced, oftentimes breed great enthusiasm, but rarely do they breed any fact. Carl now stood walking to the refrigerator and took an orange from inside. He peeled it and then, grabbing his briefcase, went into his study and sat behind his desk. Opening the left drawer, he slid back the fake bottom, revealing a number of letters. He thumbed through them and, finding the one he was looking for, pulled it out. We regret to inform you that your application as a member of the Center of Scientific Understanding has been rejected. While we appreciate your interest in COSU, we have rigid standards for ambition that must be met. We wish you the best in your advancement of knowledge. Sincerely, Alas Glotkin, COSU, Secretary. Carl folded the letter and returned it to the hidden compartment. His bitterness rose up again. He intended to prove them wrong, and the cloth was his means to do it. He could prove the existence of the cloth and its ability to do what it was proposed to do. He would not be accepted into the organization, but he would not only be accepted into their organization, but he would also demand a position of rank. The cloth that could heal and extend life, that would eclipse every artifact and invention in the COSU's inventory. It would launch them into the forefront of scientific discovery. And before all that, it could restore his family and perhaps his marriage. The clock on the mantel chimed 11. Mangle picked up his orange, eating it as he walked. At the top of the stairs, he paused in front of the door where Frida slept. He walked on toward the spare room, deciding to sleep there instead. The doors to the boys' rooms were slightly ajar. The hall light left on to chase away the boogeyman. He stepped inside. Both boys slept. He checked their covers, pulling them up to make sure the boys stayed warm. He'd heard there was a lot of sickness going around. and that was the last thing they needed. In the second bed, his oldest stirred. Dad? Sorry, I was just checking up on you. I was just checking on you. You're home late again. Ja.
Lublin.
I'm very busy right now with work and all. We haven't seen you in days. You won't be gone again this weekend, will you? I'm not sure yet. We'll see. How was your day? Okay. I made a new friend this week. Das did good. Now get to sleep. You need to stay healthy. Your lungs can't handle these colds going around. I don't want you landing in the hospital again. Yes, sir. Carl walked past the rickety wheelchair, leaning against the wall, and through the door, closing it behind him. Leave it cracked open, the boy pleaded. Good night. Night, Dad. Love you. Und ich liebe dich. Steve. Chapter 5. The next morning, Johnny waited on Emmy's porch, ready for their usual walk to school. She was late, as usual, which was frustrating because he liked being prompt. But after all they had been through, their short friendship, mystery solving, treasure finding, clearing his family name, and threats of bodily harm, he supposed lateness wasn't a big deal after all. He wondered at that moment whether he should